For decades, Washington held a simple, unbreakable rule. Iran does not get to sell oil. The sanctions regime was one of the most sophisticated financial traps ever built. But in the space of 3 weeks, that entire structure didn't just crack, it was dismantled by the very country that built it. And the reason why reveals a truth about global power that no superpower wants to admit. Welcome to Daily Reports, where you get clear, reliable, and up-to-date coverage of global events. For the better part of 2 decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran operated under the weight of what economists call maximum pressure. Oil tankers sat idle. Banks were cut off from the SWIFT system. International trade became a shadow game of front companies and covert shipments. The goal from the American side was clear: strangle the Iranian economy until it capitulated on its nuclear program and regional influence. For Iran, survival meant adaptation. It learned to build domestic supply chains. It deepened ties with China and Russia. But the core problem remained. Its primary revenue source, crude oil, was locked out of global markets. Then came the conflict in the Gulf. Within weeks, the geopolitical chessboard flipped. The country that couldn't sell a barrel of oil without risking sanctions suddenly found the United States stepping back from the very sanctions that defined American policy in the Middle East for a generation. This wasn't a diplomatic breakthrough. It wasn't a nuclear deal. This was raw, strategic necessity. And it tells us more about the future of global power than any treaty signed in Geneva. Let's rewind to the weeks leading up to the shift. The crisis in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf created a chokehold on global energy supply. Insurance rates for tankers skyrocketed. Shipping routes that normally moved millions of barrels a day became high-risk zones. Every major energy importer, from India to South Korea, started looking at their strategic reserves with alarm. The cause was simple. Physical supply lines were being severed. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 1/5 of the world's petroleum passes, became the most dangerous waterway on the planet. Now, the effect was immediate. Global oil prices began to climb, not slowly, not predictably, but with the kind of volatility that triggers emergency meetings in Washington and panic in European capitals. Inflation, already a political poison, was now tied directly to the security of a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. The consequence is where the story takes its sharp turn. The White House, faced with the prospect of oil hitting triple digits or higher, made a decision that seemed unthinkable only months earlier. It quietly lifted the sanctions that had strangled Iran's energy exports. No fanfare, no press conference declaring a new era of cooperation. Just a policy shift buried in the chaos of war. But make no mistake, this was a strategic reversal. Iran, which for years had been begging for sanctions relief in exchange for nuclear concessions, suddenly didn't have to give up anything. The relief came because the market demanded it, because the American economy, facing an election year and rising fuel costs, could not afford to keep Iranian crude locked away. This is the first layer of the story. Sanctions are not permanent structures. They are tools. And when the cost of using a tool exceeds the benefit, even superpowers abandon it. Now, let's move beyond the headlines and look at the architecture of what's really happening. The common narrative is that the United States lifted sanctions to cool oil prices. That's true on the surface, but the deeper truth involves leverage. Iran now finds itself in a position it hasn't occupied since the 1979 revolution. It has something the world needs: energy. And it has the physical ability to control access to that energy through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not about ideology. This is about structural power. Consider the numbers. Before the conflict, Iranian oil exports were heavily restricted, forced into opaque markets at discounted rates. Now, Iran is selling at market rates, or better, and critically, it's dictating terms. India, one of the world's largest importers, is now negotiating directly with Tehran. But here's the detail that changes the calculus. Iran is demanding payment in yuan, not dollars, not euros, Chinese currency. This is a direct assault on the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, the global oil trade has been denominated in US dollars, creating a perpetual demand for American currency and giving Washington unparalleled financial leverage. When a major producer like Iran, with the ability to disrupt global supply, starts demanding yuan, it creates a precedent. Other producers watch, other buyers take note. And it's not just about the currency shift. Iran is exploring what amounts to a transit tax on the Strait of Hormuz. Let's be specific. Approximately 138 vessels transit that strait daily. Each tanker carries crude and liquefied natural gas valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. Iran has already demonstrated the ability to levy what is, in effect, a toll. Reports indicate that Iranian authorities have collected fees from shipping firms, fees justified as security or passage costs. Extrapolate that. If Iran were to formalize a system of transit fees, the annual revenue could be staggering, potentially reaching hundreds of billions of dollars. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of many developed nations. That's enough money to fund a state entirely independent of foreign investment or diplomatic concessions. This transforms the strategic calculation. Iran no longer needs a nuclear deal to unlock $150 billion in frozen assets. It can generate that amount, or more, simply by controlling the maritime choke point it already dominates. From a realist perspective, this is the definition of leverage, the ability to impose costs on others while extracting value without military confrontation. Iran is not winning this position through battlefield victories. It's winning through geography and the vulnerabilities of global capitalism. Now, let's bring this down from the strategic level to the human and economic stakes, because this is where the impact touches millions of lives. For a Canadian family filling up their car, or a trucker moving goods across Ontario, the price at the pump is not abstract. It's the difference between a manageable monthly budget and financial strain. For American households, fuel costs influence everything from grocery prices to home heating. When oil prices spike, inflation follows, and inflation erodes trust in governments. This is why the White House moves so quickly. Political survival in Western democracies is tied to economic stability. Leaders can survive foreign policy defeats. They rarely survive sustained economic pain. But there's another layer, the European dimension. European nations, already reeling from the energy crisis triggered by the Ukraine war, are watching this shift with a mixture of frustration and alarm. They complied with sanctions on Russian energy. They absorbed economic shocks in solidarity with the transatlantic alliance. And now they see the United States effectively allowing Iranian oil to flow while European industries remain constrained. This creates a fracture in alliance cohesion. European policymakers are asking a pointed question. If the sanctions regime is flexible when it suits American interests, why did Europe have to bear the cost of a rigid one? That question will echo in trade negotiations, in NATO discussions, and in the broader conversation about whether the United States remains a reliable strategic partner, or simply a power that acts in its own immediate interest. Then there are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. They've long viewed Iran as a rival, but they also understand power. When Iran demonstrates it can close the strait, impose fees, and force Washington to retreat on sanctions, the Gulf states adjust their own posture. They increase diplomatic outreach to Tehran. They hedge their bets. They diversify security arrangements. This is the quiet revolution in the Middle East. The era of the United States as the sole security guarantor is fading. And in that vacuum, regional powers are recalculating their alliances. So where does this leave us? The United States has not lost a war in the traditional sense. There are no mass surrenders, no treaties signed in defeat. But it has experienced something more subtle and potentially more significant, a loss of control over a system it built. The sanctions regime was a tool of economic warfare. For years, it worked. It constrained Iran. It signaled American resolve. But tools have limits. When the tool becomes a liability, when the pain of sanctions falls more heavily on the user than the target, it gets set aside. Iran understood this. It didn't break the sanctions through diplomacy. It broke them by making the cost of enforcement too high, by creating a scenario where the only way to avoid a global economic shock was to give Iran what it wanted. This is the realist lesson. In international politics, leverage is not about who is right. It's about who can impose costs. The petrodollar system, which underpins American financial dominance for 5 decades, is now under direct challenge. When a country like Iran demands yuan for oil, it creates a crack. Cracks over time become fractures. And fractures, in a system as interconnected as global finance, can lead to structural collapse. The United States is not leaving the Middle East in a dramatic, announced retreat. But it is being pushed out, not by armies, but by incentives. By the recognition that the cost of maintaining the old order is now higher than the benefit. Here's the question that will define the next decade. Is the United States adapting to a new multipolar world, or is it being forced out of its own system? And for viewers in Canada, the United States, and Europe, how much should your country invest in alliances that are no longer reliable guarantees of stability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and the debate on this is just getting started. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to smash the bell icon so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching.